Winter's here. Let's not worry about the coughing. Now I want to look at something that's both relevant and fascinating. But before we get to the topic, I want to look at the history, because nothing is new in life. Nothing is new. Historically, emotionally, culturally, things tend to come and go. The most difficult and unstable period in any society occurs when the method via which people make a living is radically altered. Now, the Industrial Revolution over 200 years ago had profound impacts on the way people had lived in medieval Europe, where everybody basically knew their place, where hunger was managed through the provision of the commons, which were common lands which were used by serfs and people bonded to estates to augment their meagre income from the Lord. The Industrial Revolution changed all this, and in order to find the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people that were necessary to look after the machines during the Industrial Revolution, we saw the closure of the commons and the forced dislocation of hundreds of thousands of people into urban centres, where they were used as nothing more than cheap labour. Not just adults, but children. Everybody is well aware of the story of the 4-year-olds who worked in the coal mines during the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Now, it's quite possible that these changes was what led to people banding together in various ways to demand reforms, understanding they had the power to stop production if they worked together. And we saw reform movements and revolutionary movements across Europe, which saw the state change. The state was forced to change its function from an organisation which ensured that those in power continued to maintain power, but an organisation which also provided to some degree the basic necessities that people needed to survive in this new industrial age. In comes artificial intelligence in the first quarter of the 21st century. Now, artificial intelligence is going to have a profound impact on the way people earn their income in our society. A profound impact, just as profound as occurred during the Industrial Revolution. Because the way people earn an income in a capitalist society is based on two concepts, either a wage system or investments. And obviously the majority of people in any society rely on a wage system supplemented by a social security system in order to survive. But the majority are still involved in production, in work, and are paid according to the type of work they do and how long they work. Some are self-employed, some are wage earners. Now, artificial intelligence makes no distinction between wage earners, small business people, people who are sole traders, and people who are investors. Because the nature of work will dramatically be transformed. So what's this got to do with history? Over 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire faced the same dilemma. That's right. How did they find themselves in a dilemma where everything was upturned in a matter of decades? Well, as the Roman Empire expanded, the role of the plebeians, the public, in the Roman Empire began to be secondary, because their labour was no longer needed to maintain the profits and the lifestyle of the patricians. At the same time, the plebeians, unlike serfs in the Middle Ages, had some political power, just like we see in parliamentary representative democracies, where voters have some limited powers in terms of changing governments at elections. So has the plebeians, the mass of people in the city of Rome, were displaced, and they weren't displaced by artificial intelligence, they were displaced by the tens of thousands of slaves which the Roman Empire created as it conquered most of Europe, including most of Britain, the Middle East, to Syria, across to Turkey. It was an extensive empire, and every time they won a battle, there were more slaves. Now, the difference between a slave and a plebeian was the fact that all you had to do was house and feed a slave. They had no political power, none whatsoever. That's what led to a series of slave revolts. The most famous one that people are aware of is the one which was led by Spartacus. So slaves had no political power, but plebeians had. And there's an interesting account in the historical records of a Roman general, coming back from Spain with his legions and seeing plebeians on the outskirts of towns and cities living a hand-to-mouth existence, while the fortunes of the patricians escalated because of their use of slaves. So how did the Roman Empire resolve this issue? Resolve this issue of potential revolt by the majority of its citizens? Resolve the issue of increasing tensions as people were having increasing difficulties earning an income, feeding themselves and keeping a roof over their head because of the increasing number of slaves who became incorporated into the Roman economic system? Well, there is a phrase which most of us are familiar with. It's called, there's a phrase that we are all familiar with regarding how the Roman Empire quietened the rebellious plebeians. Bread and circuses. Bread and circuses was the central element of the way they were able to reincorporate plebeians back into the Roman Empire and decrease any possibility of revolts by the majority of Roman citizens whose labour was no longer needed for that society to be profitable and expand. Bread and circuses, subsidised housing for plebeians, subsidise food. But when you've got a population that is both housed and fed, it is restless. So how did they contain that restlessness? They contained that restlessness by holding games in their colosseums around the empire. We all know what they were talking about: gladiatorial games, games where criminals were slaughtered, games where opponents were slaughtered. And at the height of the Roman Empire, in the 1st century AD, Roman plebeians enjoyed 246 paid holidays. 246 holidays out of 365 days. Obviously you'd need that day to recover. So they resolved their problem of not needing the labour of people who had political power by providing bread and circuses, providing basic necessities and entertainment. Let's move to the 21st century. Now, we have seen over the last 50 years in parliamentary democracies, and that's why we have the increasing dislocation in our society, of more and more jobs during the globalisation era been exported to low-wage countries. And that unemployment or underemployment problem has resolved to a certain degree by the introduction of a social security system, which is a two-way contract. You can't work, or you won't work. We provide you with the basic necessities as long as you don't revolt. Very simple equation. I mean, most things in life are relatively simple, they're not as complex as we're told. So the introduction of artificial intelligence will radically change things, especially if that artificial intelligence is controlled by the state, as we see in authoritarian regimes, or controlled and owned by capital, as we see in Western capitalist societies, which are based on a private investment for private profit motive. So, we have an issue. As I said before, artificial intelligence will make a profound impact on the way people achieve an income. The wage system will, in a significant number of cases, no longer be relevant, because people who own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication in a capitalist society no longer need the majority of people in society to be working in order to maximise their returns on their investments. If people cannot satisfy their basic necessities, and we've seen this an increasingly issue in Australian society with increasing unemployment, increase in inflation, increase in dislocation, people in a parliamentary democracy who have some limited rights tend to revolt. Initially, protest, eventually revolution, unless society does something, as the Roman Empire did, in order to pacify its citizens that are no longer needed to be part of the productive process in order to survive. Now, the social security system is not enough. The social security system only pays the basic necessities. And if 70% of the population who are no longer needed in the workforce are on a social security system, there is the possibility of revolt and revolution. So what is the solution? What will be happening in the next 20 to 30 years, as more and more people are displaced from the workplaces, they're no longer needed in order for the people, the small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, no longer needs them to create a profit. Political parties will be forced to consider the introduction of a universal basic income. A universal basic income is much more than a social security benefit. A universal basic income is an income which every citizen and permanent resident receives from the government, not just to provide necessities, but to allow them to live a reasonable life. Because if there's no universal basic income, what will happen is there will be pressure from below for major reform and revolutionary change, which will see the actions of the Luddites during the Industrial Revolution pale into comparison to what could happen in our society with the increasing influence of artificial intelligence. So, how do you fund a universal basic income? We could actually fund a universal basic income today. And why would you give a universal basic income to a billionaire? We now have over 140 billionaires in this country. A universal basic income removes the bureaucracy. You no longer have to go through all these bureaucratic apparatus in order to justify the receipt of an income, as we're seeing with unemployment benefits and disability pensions, single parents benefits, students allowance, and the list goes on and on. So we'll deal with the issue of why everybody should receive a universal basic income first, and how you recoup those costs. Now obviously not everybody is going to be satisfied with a universal basic income. Some people will continue to be involved in the workplace. Obviously the more they earn, the more taxation on that universal basic income. And the fact is that most of that universal basic income to people who continue to be in the workforce will come back in taxation. While those people who receive a universal basic income and don't participate in the paid workforce, obviously they're participating in many activities to make their lives enjoyable, will not be paying any tax. So how do you fund it? How do you fund it in our society? How do you fund it without major reform or revolutionary change? You fund it by taxation. You fund it through the introduction of a 1% stock market tax on every time a share is bought and sold. You fund it by introducing a goods and services tax for incomes for financial transactions over $10,000. There are tens of thousands every day. You fund it by ensuring that this country's natural resources remain in the hands of the people, and that we recoup most of those profits. Because if you cannot fund, if current society cannot fund a suitable universal basic income, the ground is laid for dislocation and profound revolutionary change in this country, which will have consequences which go far beyond what we saw during the revolutionary period in the 19th and early 20th century around the globe. So it's not a matter of fearing artificial intelligence. It's a matter of allowing it to free us from the drudgery and the boredom of everyday work. It is a mechanism via which people can develop themselves through a universal basic income to the fullest potential. It is about bread and circuses, but ultimately all societies need to face the issue of how do you deal with the population, how do you deal with people when they are no longer needed for that productive process in that society. It's interesting that traditional societies may have spent 4 or 5 hours working, the hunter-gatherer societies, and a lot of their time was spent with cultural activities, religious activities. So obviously human beings need not just to be entertained, but need to be able to develop their full potential. And artificial intelligence, whether it's managed and controlled by the state or whether it's managed by the private sector, gives us that opportunity.